They say a man's home is his castle, his safe place, his freedom. But in some neighborhoods, those castles have invisible chains, rules, fines, threats, all wrapped in the smiling face of an HOA. I moved to Redwood Pines, chasing peace, not a war. But sometimes trouble doesn't knock on your door. It tries to tow your truck away in the dead of night. I wasn't looking for a fight. I didn't plan to turn a quiet suburb upside down. But when a man like Cliff Monroe pushes too far, when he mistakes fear for weakness, well, there's only one thing left to do. You stand your ground, you fight back, and sometimes you show an entire neighborhood that freedom isn't something you ask permission for, it's something you take back. One battle at a time. The night air in Redwood Pines had a crisp edge, the kind that usually made Daniel Reyes sleep like a stone. But tonight, a sharp clank of metal ripped him from his dreams. Still half asleep, Daniel grabbed the handgun he kept in the nightstand, his instincts kicking in from years of service. He slipped quietly to the window, peering through the blinds, and froze. A tow truck, hazard lights flashing in rhythmic defiance, was parked across his driveway. Its thick steel hook was already latched onto his Chevy Silverado, a truck he had bought with his own bonus money after a lifetime of federal work. Beside the truck stood a figure Daniel already recognized. Cliff Monroe, the Homeowners Association president, clipboard in hand, smirk brighter than the truck's flashing lights. Daniel threw on a t-shirt and jeans and stormed outside. His boots crunching against the gravel. Step away from the vehicle, he barked, his voice slicing through the cold. The tow truck driver, a skinny kid who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, flinched. But Cliff. He turned, slowly, like he had been expecting this confrontation all along. This vehicle, Cliff said, tapping his clipboard with unnecessary flair, violates Section 4 Sub-Rule B of the HOA regulations, oversized, non-aesthetic. It has to go. Daniel stared at him, disbelief hardening into anger. It's in my driveway, Cliff smiled thinly. Our community maintains a standard. Your choice of transportation sends the wrong message. Daniel's hands flexed at his sides. It would have been so easy, so satisfying to knock that clipboard clean out of Cliff's hands. Instead, he reached into his back pocket and pulled out his badge, holding it up to the tow truck driver. Federal agent, you're attempting to tow federal property. That's vehicle theft. The driver blanched. Sir. Look, Mr. Monroe said. Unhook the truck. Daniel ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. Sweat forming on his forehead, the driver scrambled to release the hook. Cliff's smirk finally faltered, his face paling as realization hit him. You're making a mistake, Cliff hissed under his breath, stepping closer. You think being a Fed makes you untouchable? The rules are for everyone. Daniel leaned in, voice low and calm. The rules, he said, don't include grand theft auto. Sleep tight, Cliff. He didn't wait for a response. He just walked back inside, slamming the door behind him, heart hammering against his ribs. But he knew it. This wasn't over. A man like Cliff Monroe didn't back down after losing face. He would escalate. It was in his nature. And Daniel wasn't going anywhere. The next morning, Daniel Reyes opened his front door and found a nightmare waiting for him. His mailbox was gone again. In its place stood a crooked metal pole with a laminated sheet zip-tied to it. Mailbox removed for non-compliance with HOA standards. Fine pending. Daniel let out a slow breath, counting silently to 10. His training taught him to stay cool under pressure. But this was something else. It wasn't just about a missing mailbox or a petty violation anymore. This was personal. As he stepped onto his porch, he noticed more infractions. A bright yellow notice was taped to his front door. Trash bins, improperly stored, $250 fine. Unsightly vehicle presence, $500 fine. Improper lawn maintenance, $300 fine, Daniel snorted. His lawn looked like a golf course compared to half the neighborhood, but details never mattered to a tyrant like Cliff Monroe. Around him, the neighborhood wore its usual mask of perfection. Manicured lawns, freshly power-washed driveways, Residents watering plants and walking dogs, deliberately avoiding eye contact, silent witnesses to a war they were too afraid to join. Daniel shook his head. Cowards, but he didn't blame them. Cliff had ruled Redwood Pines through intimidation for years. People paid their fines, kept their heads down, and prayed not to become a target. Daniel, however, wasn't built for surrender. He spent the rest of the day methodically installing a full perimeter of security cameras around his property. If Cliff, or his cronies, so much as breathed wrong near his home again, Daniel would have it all on film. Later that evening, he showed up at the HOA monthly meeting uninvited, unwelcomed but completely undeterred. The room was packed. Word had spread fast after the towing fiasco. Residents, most of them pretending to ignore him, whispered behind their hands. At the front table sat Cliff Monroe, flanked by the HOA board, a collection of yes-men and passive enablers. Cliff adjusted his tie, that same self-satisfied smirk plastered across his face. "Ah, Mr. Reyes," he called out smugly. "Back again so soon." Daniel crossed his arms. You could say that Cliff leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "If you are here to appeal your violations, you must submit the proper paperwork." Daniel chuckled low and humorless. "No, I'm here to shine a little light where you've been working very hard to keep things dark." Cliff's smile twitched. Daniel pulled out a folder, thick with documents, and slapped it onto the nearest table with a satisfying thud. "Funny thing about running scams, Cliff. You leave a trail." Murmurs erupted around the room. Fraudulent towing partnerships, embezzling HOA funds, fake fines, threats of foreclosure without due process. He ticked each item off like a grocery list. "You think nobody's been watching, but you forgot one thing." Daniel smiled coldly. "You picked a federal agent to mess with." The silence was thunderous. Cliff opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "This is slander." Daniel shook his head, savoring the moment. "No, Cliff. This," he held up a flash drive as evidence. He dropped it into the hands of Marcy, the timid HOA secretary, who looked like she wanted to evaporate into her chair. She clutched it like it might explode. "Forensics teams will confirm every cent you siphoned off this community." Cliff's face turned from red to gray. "You might want to call a lawyer," Daniel added. "You're gonna need one." For the first time since moving into Redwood Pines, Daniel saw it. The fear shift. It was no longer in the residents. It was in Cliff. The king was crumbling, and the kingdom was starting to realize they didn't have to bow anymore. And Daniel was just getting started. The fallout was immediate. The very next morning, Daniel Reyes woke up to something he hadn't seen before in Redwood Pines. Neighbors gathering outside, talking, whispering, planning. The fear Cliff Monroe had fed off for years was crumbling fast, replaced by something much stronger. Anger. By noon, an emergency HOA meeting was called. Daniel didn't have to be there to know what was happening. He simply sat on his porch, sipping his coffee, as a parade of residents walked into the community center, clutching folders, emails, screenshots, evidence. Inside the meeting, Cliff tried to hold on to his crumbling empire. He pounded the gavel, shouted about lies and conspiracies, tried to silence anyone who spoke out, but it was useless. One by one, neighbors stood up and told their stories. Fines for imaginary violations. The threats of foreclosure over fabricated infractions. Payments that disappeared into mysterious administrative fees. Then came the bombshell. Marcy, the HOA secretary, stood up with shaking hands and confessed. She had seen Cliff siphon funds, had helped him cover it up out of fear, and guilt had been eating her alive ever since. The room erupted. By the time Daniel strolled casually into the meeting, security footage in hand, showing Cliff illegally directing the towing of Daniel's truck, the decision was already made. A unanimous vote. Cliff Monroe was removed as HOA president, permanently banned from holding any position in the community, and referred to law enforcement for criminal prosecution. The sound of the final gavel slam was almost poetic, but Daniel wasn't interested in just seeing Cliff lose his title. He wanted real justice. Within hours, county deputies arrived. Cliff, now just another desperate man, clinging to the last threads of his ego, was handcuffed, in front of the entire neighborhood. The same neighbors he had bullied, the same ones he had fined, threatened, and humiliated for years. Daniel locked eyes with Cliff one last time, as he was led away. There was no hatred in Daniel's gaze, only cold, satisfied finality. "You started this," he thought. "You just forgot who you were dealing with." As Cliff disappeared into the back of a police cruiser, a cheer broke out from the gathered crowd. It wasn't loud or rowdy. It was pure, relieved, triumphant. That evening, the HOA board officially dissolved, replaced by a voluntary community council dedicated to transparency and fairness. No more secret meetings. No more outrageous fines. No more unchecked power. Neighbors who had barely spoken before were now swapping stories, laughing, shaking hands. For the first time, Redwood Pines actually felt like a community. As Daniel walked back to his porch, several residents approached him, gratitude in their eyes. "Thank you for standing up," Mrs. Willis said, her voice trembling. "I thought we'd be stuck under his thumb forever," added Mr. Patel. Daniel smiled and shook his head. "You stood up too. You just needed a little push." Later that night, as the stars blinked over the quiet streets of Redwood Pines, Daniel sat on his porch, sipping a well-earned beer, the smell of freshly cut grass hanging in the warm air. The war was over. The neighborhood had been freed, and Daniel, he was exactly where he was supposed to be, home.